Many of the deepest fractures in moral and philosophical reasoning rise not from exotic metaphysical puzzles, but from something far more familiar. The way people use their own intuitions, attitudes, and preferences as if they were self-authenticating sources of justification. When a belief collides with another commitment they already hold, the tension is often not treated as a genuine inconsistency demanding explanation. Instead, the person invokes a psychological state. This just feels different to me. As if that alone dissolves the contradiction. What follows is not reasoning, but insulation. A worldview protected from revision by elevating subjective reactions into epistemic vetoes. This essay examines how that maneuver works, why it fails, and how it quietly transforms ordinary psychological states into brute, unaccountable foundations. Many people attempt to resolve tensions in their worldview by appealing to intuition, attitude, or personal preference as if these were foundational justifiers. When a proposition they hold appears to contradict their own prior commitments, they do not treat this as a genuine inconsistency requiring explanation. Instead, they invoke intuition as a kind of epistemic veto. If their intuition says, two cases are not analogous, then, so the claim goes, that intuition itself is evidence that no contradiction exists. The result is that an actual structural inconsistency is dismissed as merely apparent, and the worldview is preserved without revision. This maneuver works only by treating intuition as sovereign, rather than accountable. Instead of identifying a relevant difference between the cases or explaining why the analogy fails, the person simply asserts that their intuition counts as the relevant difference. This collapses justification into psychological reaction. It allows the person to block any reductio, counterexample, or coherence constraint by fiat. In effect, intuition becomes a trump card that overrides logic, structure, and the person's own previously accepted principles. A worldview insulated in this way becomes unfalsifiable. No contradiction can ever force revision, because intuition can always be invoked to dissolve it. Once intuition is elevated to this status, the person's fundamental position becomes a black hole that absorbs every challenge. Any tension is explained away by reasserting the stance rather than examining it. This is not explanation but restatement. It also leads directly into the metaphysical bruteness problem. If intuitions are treated as irreducible and ungrounded, then the worldview becomes a stack of brute commitments. Things are the case simply because they are, with no deeper reason. The structure of justification collapses into a series of unexamined givens. The deeper issue is that this move eliminates the possibility of rational revision. If intuition can override any principle, then no principle can constrain belief. If intuition can dissolve any contradiction, then no contradiction can ever matter. The person's commitments become immune to scrutiny, and disagreement becomes unintelligible because there is no shared standard for evaluating claims. Intuition, instead of functioning as defeasible evidence within a broader web of reasons, becomes a tool for protecting identity, cognitive dissonance, and resisting the vulnerability of genuine reflection. A healthy epistemic stance requires that intuitions be integrated rather than sovereign. They must be open to challenge, capable of being explained, and constrained by coherence with one's other commitments. When someone refuses to do this, when they use intuition to block rather than illuminate, they are not engaging in reasoning at all. They are constructing an epistemic shield that preserves their worldview at the cost of its integrity. Here are 3 examples, one using preference, one using attitude, and one using intuition, that illustrate the epistemic failure we're diagnosing. Each example shows how a person uses a psychological state to block contradiction, avoid explanation, and thereby expose the methodological weakness of different metaethical approaches. 1. Preference case. I just prefer this, so the contradiction isn't real. A person claims to prefer maximizing freedom as their core moral value. They also claim that banning certain foods is morally wrong because it restricts freedom. But when confronted with an analogy showing that their support for banning certain drugs is structurally identical, both restrict freedom for paternalistic reasons, they reject the analogy outright. They say, I just have a preference for allowing food freedom, but not drug freedom. That preference itself shows the cases aren't analogous. Here, preference is used as a shield. Instead of explaining the relevant difference, they treat the preference as evidence that no contradiction exists. The worldview becomes self-sealing. This exposes a methodological flaw in preference-based subjectivism. Preferences cannot justify themselves, and when used to block structural comparison, they collapse into brute commitments. 2. Attitude case. My attitude tells me these cases are different, so they are. Someone claims to have a strong moral attitude against causing unnecessary suffering. They condemn factory farming on this basis, but when shown that their support for certain forms of animal entertainment, e.g. rodeos, involves the same kind of unnecessary suffering, they refuse the analogy. They say, I have a different attitude toward rodeos. My attitude tells me it's not the same kind of harm. No explanation is given. No morally relevant difference is identified. The attitude is treated as a defeater of the structural similarity. This reveals a weakness in attitude-based expressivism. Attitudes can conflict with each other, and without a higher-order standard, the person can simply declare any tension non-analogous by fiat. The contradiction is not resolved, only dismissed. 3. Intuition case. My intuition says they're not analogous, so the contradiction disappears. A person endorses a principle. If an action violates bodily autonomy, it is morally wrong. They use this to argue against forced medical procedures, but when confronted with an analogy showing that their support for certain forms of compulsory vaccination also violates bodily autonomy, they reject the analogy by appealing to intuition. My intuition tells me these cases are totally different. That intuition is evidence that the contradiction is only presumed. Here, intuition is treated as a sovereign veto. The person does not identify a relevant difference or revise their principle. Instead, intuition is used to block the contradiction. This exposes a central problem in intuition-based moral epistemology. Intuitions can be invoked to immunize a worldview from coherence constraints, turning them into brute, unexplained commitments. Why these three cases matter. Together, these examples show how preference, attitude, and intuition can each be misused as contradiction dissolvers, explanation substitutes, epistemic trump cards, brute foundational commitments. Each discovery method, preference, attitude, intuition, contains within it the possibility of unexplained justification, where a person can preserve their worldview by refusing to integrate their commitments into a coherent structure. In this light, take the classic example of a glass that's filled to 50%. One person calls it half full, another calls it half empty. If your intuition or preference is to describe it as half full rather than half empty, that inclination isn't just a raw preference floating in space. There has to be some underlying reason, some conceptual framing, value, or interpretive lens that makes that description feel more natural to you. Even though the physical evidence is identical, the brute fact is simply that the glass contains 50% liquid. But the moment we try to articulate what that means to us, we move beyond brute facts and start relying on additional explanatory components, psychological, linguistic, pragmatic, or normative. Those components are what give the description its meaning and justification. Without them, appealing to intuition, preference, or attitude alone doesn't actually explain why one framing is justified over the other. It just restates the stance rather than grounding it. If you want it expanded into a fuller philosophical sentence, here's a slightly richer version. In this view, meaning isn't found in the raw origin of a claim, but in the lived process, the interpretive path, and the justificatory work through which we arrive at it. This ties neatly back to the earlier point about the glass. The brute fact, 50% full, doesn't carry the meaning. The interpretive trajectory does. When we look closely at these patterns, preference treated as proof, attitude treated as argument, intuition treated as authority, we see the same structural failure repeating itself. Each psychological state becomes a way to halt inquiry rather than deepen it, a method for preserving a worldview rather than understanding it. But genuine justification cannot rest on brute commitments, and coherence cannot survive if contradictions are dismissed rather than confronted. To reason well is not to silence our intuitions, attitudes, or preferences, but to integrate them into a structure where they can be explained, challenged, and revised. Meaning emerges not from the raw origin of a stance, but from the justificatory path that gives it shape. When we refuse that path, we trade understanding for comfort. When we embrace it, we recover the possibility of genuine reflection, and with it, the integrity of our moral and epistemic lives.